Hello there. We're live. So, now today I thought it would be something just a little less taxing for attention, as it was, compared to yesterday. Now I'm going to. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start off by reading some. Oh, I actually did remember using. Sorry, I just found a good. I just found this photo and I'm going to use it for the or the sorry, for the thumbnail for the sorry, I'm trying to find. I found this cover image, and I'm trying to find a way to actually use it. Okay, let me just copy this. That would be that one. Okay. If nobody, I have everything set up, but again, it was not advertised ahead of time that much. I apologize for that. It was better than yesterday, but still. Well, the thing is, I will wait a bit, but if no one shows up, I will have to cancel the entire stream and try tomorrow. Because I don't really feel it has a point to make a stream with 0 people watching it. So, yeah, if that happens, I will actually cancel it and private it and remove all notifications and messages about it, and then re-advertise it tomorrow again, acting like this never happened. So basically, I guess I'm just going to sit here and wait until someone shows up. If someone shows up. I'm just going. I can go check out the thing. We're not. Oh, hey. Oh, I was just about to cancel the stream. So, hey. I'm glad you're here because that means I don't actually have to, at least hopefully, don't have to actually, purge this stream and all references to it everywhere, so I can pretend it never happened. So, yeah, okay. Yes, you too. I don't actually know. Well, I don't really need. I've never needed a moderator. I don't suppose that's going to change anytime soon. I can take this down. And yeah, I'm just going to wait for a few seconds, minutes, hours until someone. Oh, not really. I'm just wanted to give a few more minutes time if someone else is going to show up, but it won't be necessary really. So again, I admit the fault is entirely mine for being a bit too spontaneous. I just didn't really know if I was going to do it or not. So there's that. So I guess I'm going to go to share screening now and actually sit. And it isn't when I do make these streams and make them without announcement a few hours ahead of time. At least that's my fault. I'm entirely too spontaneous sometimes, and I want to do it, but I don't know if I'll get to it because I don't know how I'm going to feel physically, and that's kind of why I've been kind of failing to properly set up a schedule, which that's entirely my fault. I apologize. Okay, let me just set up this, and we can start with the first story. In the first few stories we're going to do will be from what we've covered previously, and then I'm going to try and read some stuff that I haven't read yet personally, but we have covered partially stuff from the same connection. Anyway, I'm going to just shut up. I'm going to start now. There is of course, now I wonder. There is one story from the collection by Valery Brussof I wanted to cover, or two specifically. I just have to scroll through the entire. I remember this one was okay. This one was a bit more of a melodrama. Yes. Okay. So how many pages is this? 9407. I do want to cover this. I just want to make sure that it's the one I wanted. Okay, yeah, sure. Yes, this is it. And it's followed by Eluli, son of Eluli. Okay, so let's actually start properly with... I have to scroll back through this just to get to the beginning again. Hold on. So, just checking the chat a second. And then, yeah. The story is called Rhea Silvia, a story from the life of the 6th century. Maria was the daughter of Rufus the scribe. She was not yet 10 years old when, on the 17th of December, 546, Rome was taken by Totila, the king of the Goths. The magnanimous victor ordered bugles to be blown all night, so that the Roman people might escape from their native town as soon as they realized the danger of remaining there. Totila knew the violence of his soldiers, and he had no wish that all the population of the ancient capital of the world should perish by the swords of the Goths. So Rufus and his wife Florencia fled with their little daughter Maria. An enormous crowd of refugees from Rome left the city through the night by the Appian Way, hundreds of them falling exhausted on the road. The greater number, among whom were Rufus and his family, succeeded in getting as far as Bovillae, where however very many were unable to find shelter. Many of them had to camp out in the open. Later on, they were all scattered in various directions, seeking some place of refuge. Some went to the Campagna and were taken prisoners by the Goths, who were in possession there. Some got as far as the sea and were even able to get out to Sicily. The rest either remained as beggars in the neighborhood of Bovillae or managed to get into Samnium. Rufus had a friend living near Corbio. To this poor man, Anthony by name, who earned a living by rearing pigs on a small plot of land, Rufus brought his family. Anthony took the fugitives in and shared with them his scanty store, and while living in the swineherd's wretched hut, Rufus heard all of the misfortunes which came upon Rome. At one time, Totila threatened to rear the eternal city to its foundations and turn it into a place of pasture. But the Gothic king afterwards relented and contented himself by burning several districts of the town and pillaging all that still remained from the cupidity and violence of Alaric, Genseric, and Ricimer. In the spring of 546, Totila left Rome, but he took off with him all the inhabitants who had remained in the city. For 40 days, the capital of the world stood empty. There was not a human being left in it, and along its streets wandered only frightened animals and wild beasts. Then timidly, a few at a time, the Romans began to return to their city, and a little later Rome was occupied by Belisarius, and was once more united to the dominions of the Eastern Empire. Then Rufus and his family returned to Rome. They sought out their little house on the Remuria, which by reason of its insignificance had been spared by the spoilers. Almost all the poor belongings of Rufus were found to be intact, including the library and its rolls of parchment so precious to the scribe. It seemed as if it might be possible to forget all the misfortunes they had undergone, as in some oppressive dream, and to continue their former life. But very soon it became clear that such a hope was deceptive. The war was far from being at an end. Rome had to endure another siege by Totila, when again the inhabitants died in hundreds from hunger and lack of water. Then, when the Goths at length raised their unsuccessful siege, Belisarius also left Rome, and the city acknowledged the rule of the covetous Byzantine Conon, from whom the Romans fled as from an enemy. At a later period, the Goths, taking advantage of treacherous sentries, occupied Rome for the second time. This time, however, Totila not only refrained from plundering the city, but he even strove to bring into it some kind of order, and he wished to restore the ruined buildings. At length, after the death of Totila, Rome was taken by Narses. This was in 552. It would be difficult to show clearly how Rufus managed to live through these 6 calamitous years. In the time of war and siege, no one had need of the art of a scribe. No one any longer gave Rufus an order for a transcription from the works of the ancient poets or the fathers of the church. In the city there were no authorities to whom it might be necessary to address petitions of various kinds. There were not many people, money was very scarce, and food supplies scarcer still. He had to make a living by any kind of accidental work, serving either Goths or Byzantines, not disdaining to be a stonemason when the town walls were being repaired, or to be a porter of baggage for the troops. And with all this, the entire family often went hungry, not only for days, but for whole weeks. Wine was not to be thought of. The only drink was bad water from the cisterns or from the Tiber, for the aqueducts had been destroyed by the Goths. It was only possible to endure such privations by knowing that everybody, without exception, was subject to them. The descendants of senators and patricians, the children of the richest and most illustrious families, would ask on the streets for a piece of bread as beggars. Rusticiana, the daughter of Symmachus, a widow of Boetius, held out her hand for alms. It was not to be wondered at during these years the little Maria who left very much was left very much to her own devices. In her early childhood, her father had taught her to read from Greek and Latin, but after their return to Rome, he had no time to occupy himself further with her education. For whole days together she would do just what she thought she would. Her mother did not require her help in housekeeping, for there was hardly any housekeeping to be done. In order to pass the time, Maria used to read the books which were still preserved in the house, as there was no one who would buy them. But more often she would go out of the house and wander like a little wild animal about the deserted streets, forums, and squares, much too broad for the now insignificant populace. The few passers-by soon became accustomed to the black-eyed girl in ragged garments who ran about everywhere like a mouse, and they paid no attention to her. Rome became, as it were, an immense home for Maria. She knew it better than any writer who had described its noteworthy treasures of old time. Day after day she would go out into the immense area of the city where over 1,000,000 people had once dwelt, and she would learn to love some corners of it and detest others. And it was often not until late evening that she would return to her father's cheerless roof, where it often happened that she would go supperless to bed after a whole day spent on her feet. In her wanderings through the town, Maria would visit the most remote districts on either side of the Tiber, where there were empty, partly burned-down houses, and there she could dream of the greatness of Rome in the past. She would examine the few statues which still remained whole in the squares, the immense bull on the Bull Forum, the giant elephants in bronze on the Sacred Way, the statues of Domitian, Marcus Aurelius, and other famous men of ancient time, the columns, obelisks, and bas-reliefs, striving to remember what she had read about them all, and if her knowledge was scanty, she would supplement it by any story she had read. She would go into the abandoned palaces of people who had once been rich, and admire the pitiful remains of former luxury in the decoration of the rooms, the mosaic of the floors, the various coloured marble of the walls, the sumptuous tables, chairs, candlesticks, which in some places still remained. In this way she visited the ruined baths, which were like separate towns within the city, and were entirely deserted because there was no water to supply their insatiable pipes. In some of the buildings could still be seen magnificent marble reservoirs, mosaic floors, bathing chairs, baths of precious alabaster or porphyry, and in some half-destroyed statues, which had escaped being used by the Goths and Byzantines as materials for hurling at the enemy from the ballista. In the quietness of the enormous rooms, Maria would hear echoes of the rich and careless lives of the thousands and thousands of people who had gathered there daily to meet friends, to discuss literature or philosophy, and to anoint their effeminate bodies before festival banquets. In the grand circus, which now looked like a wild ravine, for it was all overgrown with weeds and tall grasses, Maria thought of the triumphant horse racing competitions on which thousands of spectators had gazed and deafened the fortunate victors with a storm of applause. She could not but know of these festivals, for the last of them, oh pitiful shadow of past splendour, had been arranged once more in her own lifetime by Totila during his second sovereignty in Rome. Sometimes Maria would simply walk along the Tiber bank, sit down in some comfortable spot under some half-ruined wall, and look at the yellow waters of the river made famous by poets and artists. And in the quietness of the deserted place she would think and dream again. She became accustomed to live in her dreams. The half-ruined, half-abandoned town fed her imagination generously. Everything she heard from her elders, everything she read in her disorderly fashion from her father's books, mingled itself in her brain into a strange, chaotic, but endlessly captivating representation of the great and ancient city. She was convinced that the former Rome had been in reality the concentration of all beauty, a marvellous town where all was enchantment, where all life had been one continuous festival. Centuries and epochs were confused in her poor little head. The time of Orestes seemed to her no farther away than the rule of Trajan, and the reign of the wise Numa Pompilius as near as that of Odoacer. For her, antiquity comprised all that preceded the Goths. Far away, but still happy, was the olden time, the rule of the great Theodoric. The new time began for her at her birth, at the time of the first siege of Rome, in the time of Belisarius. In antiquity, everything seemed to Maria to be marvelous, beautiful, wonderful. In the olden time, in the old in the olden time, all was attractive and fortunate. In modern times, everything was miserable and dreadful. And she tried not to notice the cruel reality of the present, but to live in her dreams in the antiquity which she loved, with her favourite heroes, among whom were the god Bacchus, Camillus, the second founder of the city, Caesar, who had been exalted up to the stars in the heavens, Diocletian, the wisest of all people, and Romulus Augustulus, the unhappiest of all the great. All these and many others whose names she had only heard by chance were the beloved of her reveries and the ordinary apparitions of her childish dreams. Little by little in her dreams Maria created her own history of Rome, not at all like that which was told at one time by the eloquent Livy and afterward by other historians and annalists. And she admired as she admired the statues which still remained whole and read their half-erased inscriptions, Maria interpreted everything in her own way and found everywhere corroboration of her own unrestrained imagination. She said to herself that such and such a statue represented the young Augustus, and nothing would then have convinced her that it was a bad portrait of some half-barbarian who had lived only 50 years ago, and had forced some ignorant maker of tombs to immortalize his features in a piece of cheap marble. Or when she looked at a bas-relief depicting some scene from the Odyssey, she would create from it a long story in which her beloved heroes would again figure, Mars, Brutus, or the Emperor Honorius, and would soon be convinced that she had read this story in one of her father's books. She would create legend after legend, myth after myth, and live in their world as one more real than the world of books, and still more real than the pitiful world which encompassed her. After she had dreamed for a sufficiently long time, and when she felt tired out by walking and exhausted by hunger, Maria would return home. There her mother, who had become bad-tempered from the misfortune she had endured, would meet her gloomily, roughly push her a piece of bread and a morsel of cheese, or a head of garlic if there happened to be one in the kitchen, adding occasionally some scolding words to the meagre supper. Maria, unsociable as a captive bird, would eat what had been given her, and then hasten away to her little room and its hard bed to dream again until she slept, and then dream again in her sleep about the blessed dazzling times of antiquity. On especially happy days, when her father happened to be at home and in a good temper, he would sometimes have a chat with Maria, and their talk would quickly turn to the ancient times so dear to them both. Maria would question her father about bygone Rome, and then hold her breath while the old scribe, led away by this theme, would begin to talk of the great empire in the time of Theodosius, or recite verses from the ancient poets Virgil, Ausonius, and Claudian, and the chaos in her poor little head would fall into still greater confusion, and at times it would begin to seem to her that her actual life was only a dream, and that in reality she was living in the blessed times of Ennius Augustus or Gratian. After the occupation of Rome by Narses, life in the city began to take more or less its ordinary course. The ruler established himself on the Palatine. Some of the desolate rooms of the imperial palace were renovated for him, and in the evenings they were lit up with lamps. The Byzantines had brought money with them, and trade in Rome began to revive. The main streets became comparatively safe, and the impoverished inhabitants of the empty Campagna brought provisions into Rome to sell. Here and there wine taverns were reopened. There was even a demand for articles of luxury, which were purchased mainly by the frivolous women who, like a flock of ravens, followed the mongrel armies of the great eunuch. Monks went to and fro along the streets, and from them also was possible to make some sort of profit. The 30 or 40,000 inhabitants now gathered together in Rome, including the troops, gave to the city, especially in the central districts, the appearance of a populous and even a lively place. There was found at length some real work for Rufus. Narses, and afterwards his successor, the Byzantine general, received various complaints and petitions for the copying of which the art of the scribe was required. The edicts of Justinian acknowledged some of the acts of the Gothic kings, and repudiating others afforded pretext for endless chicanery and process of law. Rufus sometimes had to copy papers addressed directly to His Holiness the Emperor in Byzantium, and for these he was comparatively well paid. And more important orders came to him. A new monastery wanted to have a written list of its service books. A whimsical person ordered a copy of the poems of the famous Rutilius. In the house of Rufus there was once more a certain sufficiency. The family could have dinner every day, and need no longer feel anxious about the morrow. Everything might have been well in Rufus's home if the scribe, who had aged greatly in consequence of years of deprivation, had not taken to drink. Oftentimes he left all his earnings in some tavern or other. This was a heavy blow for Florencia. She struggled in every way to combat the unhappy passion of her husband, and tried to take from him all the money he earned, but Rufus descended to every sort of artifice, and always found means of getting drunk. Maria, on the contrary, loved the days of her father's drunken bouts. Then he would come home in a gay mood, and pay no attention to the tears and reproaches of Florencia, but would eagerly call Maria to him if she were at home, talk to her again endlessly about the old greatness of the eternal city, and read to her verses from the old poets and those of his own composition. The half-witted girl and her drunken father somehow understood one another, and they often sat together till late in the night, after the angry Florencia had left them and gone to bed alone. Maria herself did not change her way of life. In vain her father, when sober, forced her to help him in his work. In vain her mother was angry with her daughter for not sharing with her the cares of housekeeping. When Maria was obliged, she would against her will sullenly transcribe a few lines or peel a few onions, but at the first opportunity she would run out of the house to wander all day again in her favourite corners of the city. She was scolded on her return, but she listened silently to all her reproaches and made no reply. What mattered scoldings to her when in her vision there still glistened all the sumptuous pictures with which her imagination had been soothed while she had been hidden near a porphyry basin in the baths of Caraculus, or had lain secreted in the thick grass on the banks of old Tiber. For the sake of not having her visions taken from her, she would willingly have endured blows and every kind of torture. In these visions were all her life. In the autumn of 554, Maria saw the streets of Rome, the triumphant processions of Narses, the last triumph celebrated in the eternal city. The eunuchs' troops of many different races, among whom were Greeks, Huns, Heruli, Gepidae, Persians, passed in an inharmonious crowd along the sacred way, bearing rich booty taken from the Goths. The soldiers sang gay songs in the most diverse languages, and their voices mingled in wild and deafening cries. The general, crowned with laurel, drove in a chariot drawn by white horses. At the gates of Rome he was met by men dressed in white togas, making themselves out to be senators. Narses went through half-demolished Rome, along streets in which the grass had grown up between the mighty paving stones in the direction of the capital. There he laid down his crown before a statue of Justinian, obtained from somewhere or other for this occasion. Then he went on foot through the town once more, going back to the Basilica of St. Peter, where he was met by the Pope and clergy in festival robes. The Roman people crowded into the streets and gazed at the spectacle without any special enthusiasm, though the child actors had done their utmost to make it magnificent. Though the chief actors had done their utmost to make it magnificent. The Byzantine triumph was for Romans something foreign, almost like a triumph of the enemies of their native land. And on Maria the triumphal procession made no impression whatever. She looked with indifferent eyes upon the medley of colours in the soldiers' garments, on the triumphal toga of a eunuch, a small beardless old man with shifty eyes, and on the festal robes of the priests. The songs and martial cries of the soldiers only aroused her horror. It all seemed to her so different from the triumphs she had so often imagined in her lonely vision, the triumphs of Augustus, Vespasian, Valentinian. Here everything appeared to her to be strange and ugly. There all had been magnificence and beauty. And without waiting to see the whole of the procession, Maria ran away from the Basilica of St. Peter onto the Appian Way, to the ruined baths of Caraculla, which she loved, so that in the quietness of the marble hall she might weep freely over the irrevocable past and see it anew in her dreams, living and beautiful as it alone could be. Maria went home late that day and did not wish to answer any questions as to whether she had seen the procession. At this time Maria was nearly 18. She was not beautiful. She was thin, her figure was undeveloped, and with her wild black eyes and the hectic colour in her cheeks, she rather affrighted than attracted attention. She had no friend. When the young girls of the neighbourhood spoke to her, she answered abruptly and in monosyllables, and hastened to bring the conversation to an end. How could they, these other girls, understand her sacred dreams, her sacred visions? Of what could she speak with them? She was thought not so much to be stupid as imbecile. And then she never went to church. Sometime on the deserted streets a drunken passer-by would come up to her and try to take her arm or embrace her. Then Maria would turn on him like a wild cat, scratching, biting, hitting out with her fists, and she would be left in peace. One young man, however, the son of a neighbouring coppersmith, had wanted to pay attention to her. When her mother spoke to her about him, Maria heard the news with unfeigned horror. When her mother became insistent, saying that she could not now find a better husband anywhere, Maria began to sob in such desperation that Florencia left her alone, making up her mind that her daughter was either too young to be married, or that she was indeed not quite in her right mind. So Maria was allowed to live in freedom and to fill up her endless leisure time as she pleased. So passed days and weeks and months. Rufus worked and drank. Florencia busied herself over her housekeeping and scolded. Both thought themselves unhappy and cursed their wretched fate. Maria alone was happy in the world of her fancies. She began to pay less and less attention to the hateful actuality of her surroundings. She went deeper and deeper into the kingdom of her visions. She already held conversations with the forms which her imagination had created as which her imagination created as with living people. She used to return home with the conviction that today she had met the goddess Vesta or the dictator Sulla. She would remember the things she had imagined as if they had actually taken place. When she talked with her father at nights, she would tell him all her remembrances, and the old Rufus would not be amazed. Every story of her gave him a pretext for being ready with some lines of poetry. He would complete and develop the insane fancies of his daughter, and as she listened sleepily to their strange conversations, Florencia would sometimes spit and pronounce a curse, sometimes cross herself and whisper a prayer to the Holy Virgin. In the spring following the triumphal procession of Narcissus, Maria was one day wandering near the ruined walls of the Baths of Trajan, when she noticed that in one place, where evidently the Esquiline hill took its rise, there was a strange opening in the ground, like an entrance somewhere. The district was a deserted one. All around there were only deserted and uninhabited houses. The pavements were broken, and the steep slope of the hill was overgrown with tall grass. After some effort, Maria succeeded in getting to the opening. Beyond it was a dark and narrow passage. Without hesitation, she crawled into it. She had to crawl for a long way in utter darkness and a stifling atmosphere. At the end of the passage there was a sudden drop. When Maria's eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, she could distinguish by the faint light which came from the opening by which she had entered that in front of her was a spacious hall of some unknown palace. After a little reflection, the girl considered that she would not be able to see it without a light. She went back cautiously, and all that day she wandered about pondering on the matter. Rome seemed to her to be her own property, and she could not endure the idea that there was anything in the city about which she knew nothing. The next day, having secured a homemade torch, Maria returned to the place. Not without some danger to herself, she had gone down the hall she had discovered, and there lighted the torch. A stately chamber presented itself to her gaze. The lower half of the walls was of marble, and above it were painted marvellous pictures. Bronze statues stood in niches, amazing work, for the statues seemed to be living people. It was possible to distinguish the floor now covered with earth and rubbish. It was possible to distinguish that the floor now covered with earth and rubbish was a mosaic. After admiring this new spectacle, Maria was emboldened to go further. Through an immense door she passed into a whole labyrinth of passages and cross-passages, leading her into a new hall, still more magnificent than the first. Further on was a lone suite of rooms, decorated with marble and gold, with wall paintings and statuary. In many places there still remained valuable furniture and spacious domestic articles of fine workmanship. Spiders, lizards, soul-bugs ran around. Bats fluttered here and there. But Maria, enthralled by the unique spectacle, saw nothing of them. Before her was the life of ancient Rome, living in all its fullness, discovered by her at last. How long she enjoyed herself there on the first day of her discovery she did not know. She was overcome either by her strong agitation or by the foul atmosphere. When she came to her senses again, she was on a damp stone floor, and her torch was extinguished, having burned itself out. In utter darkness she began groping to seek a way out. She wandered for a long time, for many hours, but only became confused in the countless passages and rooms. In the misty consciousness of the girl there was a glimmer of a notion that she was fated to die in this unknown palace, which was itself buried under the ground. Such an idea did not alarm Maria. On the contrary, it seemed to her both beautiful and desirable to end her life among these splendid remains of ancient life in a marble hall, at the foot of a beautiful statue somewhere or other. She was only sorry for one thing, that darkness lay around her, that she was not fated to see the beauty in the midst of which she was to die. Suddenly a ray of light shone before her. Gathering up her strength, Maria went towards it. It was the light of the moon shining through an opening like that by which she had entered the palace. But this opening was in an entirely different hall. By great effort, scrambling up the projections of the walls, Maria got out into the open air in an hour when the whole city was already asleep, and the moon reigned in her full glory over the heaps of half-ruined buildings. Keeping close by the walls, in order to attract no attention, Maria reached home almost dead from exhaustion. Her father was absent. He did not come at all that night, and her mother uttered only a few coarse outcries. After this, Maria began daily to visit the subterranean palace she had discovered. Little by little she learnt all its corridors and halls, so that she could wander about them in utter darkness, without fear of losing her way again. She always carried with her, however, a little lamp or resin torch, so that she could adequately enjoy the sumptuous decorations of the rooms. She learned to know all about them. She knew the rooms which were covered with paintings and decorations in crimson, others where a yellow colour predominated, others which by the green of the paintings reminded her of fresh meadows or a garden, others which were all white with ornamentations of black ebony. She knew all the wall paintings, some of which depicted scenes from the lives of gods and heroes. Some showed the great battles of antiquity, some showed the portraits of great men, others the ridiculous adventures of fauns and cupids. She knew all the statues that were preserved in the palace, both bronze and marble, the small busts in the niches, the glorious piece of sculpture of entire figures of enormous size, which represented three people, a man and two youths, who were encircled in the coils of a gigantic serpent, and were vainly striving to free themselves from its fatal embrace. But of all the decorations in the underground palace, Maria especially loved one bas-relief. It represented a young girl, slim and graceful, resting in a deep sleep in a kind of cave. Near her stood a youth in warlike armour, with a noble face of marvellous beauty. Above them, as it were in the clouds, was depicted a woven basket containing two young children floating on a river. It seemed to Maria that the features of the young girl in the picture were like her own. She recognized herself in the slim sleeping princess, and for whole hours she would untiringly admire her, imagining herself in her place. At times Maria was ready to believe that some ancient artist had marvellously divined that at some time a young girl Maria would appear in the world, and that he had by anticipation created her portrait in the bas-relief of the mysterious enchanted palace, which must have been preserved untouched under the earth for hundreds of years. The significance of the other figure in the bas-relief The significance of the other figures in the bas-relief was not realized by her for a long time. But one evening Maria happened once more to have a talk with her father, who had come home drunk and in a gay mood. They were alone, for Florencia, as usual, had left them to their foolish chattering and had gone to bed. Maria told her father of the underground palace she had discovered and of its treasures. The old Rufus listened to this story in the same way as he had heard all the other fancies of his daughter. When she used to tell him that she had that day met Constantine the Great in the street, and that he had graciously conversed with her, Rufus would not be surprised, but he would begin to talk about Constantine. And now, when Maria spoke to him of the treasures of the underground palace, the old scribe had once talked about this palace. Yes, little daughter, said he, between the Palatine and the Esquiline it really is there. It is the golden house of the Emperor Nero, the most beautiful palace ever built in Rome. Nero had not sufficient space for it, and he set fire to Rome. Rome was burnt, and the emperor recited verses about the burning of Troy. And afterwards, on the space that had been clear, he built his golden house. Yes, it was between the Palatine and the Esquiline. You're right. There was nothing more beautiful in the city. But after Nero's death, other emperors destroyed the palace out of envy and heaped earth upon it. It existed no longer. They built houses and baths on its site, but it was the most beautiful of all the palaces. Then, having become bolder, Maria told her father about her beloved bas-relief, and again the old scribe was not surprised. He at once expressed to his daughter what the artist had wished to express. That, my daughter, is Rhea Silvia, the Vestal Virgin, daughter of King Numitor. But a youth, this god Mars, fell in love with the maiden and sought her out in the sacred cave. Twin sons were born to them, Romulus and Remus. Rhea Silvia was drowned in the Tiber. The infants were suckled by a wolf, and they became the founders of the city. Yes, that is how it all was, my daughter. Rufus told Maria in details the touching story of the guilty Vestal Ilia, or Rhea Silvia, and he at once began to recite some lines from the Metamorphoses of the ancient Nassau. Proximus auxonais inustili mille amuli rexi opes. But Maria was not listening to her father. She was repeating quietly to herself, "It is Rhea Silvia, Rhea Silvia." After that day, Maria spent still more of her Sorry, I need to drink. After that day, Maria spent still more of her time looking at the wonderful bas-relief. She would take a scanty luncheon with her, as well as a torch, so that she might state some hours longer in the underground palace, which she considered to be more her own home than her father's house. She would lie on the cold and slippery floor in front of the sculptor daughter of Numitor, and by the faint light of a resinous torch, she would gaze for long hours at the features of the slender maiden sleeping in a sacred cave. With every day it became more apparent to Maria that she was strangely like this ancient Vestal, and little by little in her dreams she became less able to distinguish which was poor Maria, the daughter of Rufus the scribe, and which the unhappy Ilia, daughter of the king of Alba Longa. She always called herself Rhea Silvia. Lying in front of the picture, she would dream that to her, in this new sacred cave, the god Mars would appear, and that from their divine embrace there would be born out of her the twins Romulus and Remus, who would become the founders of the eternal city. True, she would have to pay for this by her death, and be drowned in the muddy waters of the Tiber. But could death terrify Maria? She often fell asleep while musing thus before the bas-relief, and dreamed of this same god Mars with his noble face of marvelous beauty and his divine consuming embrace. And when she awoke, she would not know whether it had been a dream or reality. It was already scorching July when the streets of Rome at midday were as empty as after the terrible command of King Totila. But in the underground palace it was damp and cool. Maria, as before, went there every day to muse in her habitual sweet reveries before the pictured Ilia, who lay dreaming of the god destined for her. And one day, when in a slight doze she was once again giving herself up to the ardent caresses of the god Mars, suddenly a noise of some kind roused her to awake. She opened her eyes, not understanding anything as yet, and glanced around. By the light of the little torch, which she had placed in a cranny between the stones, she saw before her a young man. He was not in a warlike armour, but wore the dress usually worn at that time by poor Romans. His face, however, was full of nobility, and to Maria it appeared radiant with a marvellous beauty. For some moments she looked with amazement on the unexpected apparition, on the man who had found his way into the enchanted palace, which she had thought unknown to anyone save herself. Then, sitting upright on the floor, the girl asked simply, "You have come to me?" The young man smiled, a quiet and attractive smile, and answered by another question. "But who are you, maiden? The genius of this place?" Maria answered, "I am Rhea Silvia, Vestal Virgin, daughter of King Numitor. And you are not the god Mars come in search of me?" "No, I am no god," objected the young man. "I am a mortal, my name is Agapit, and I was not searching here for you. But all the same, I am glad to find you. Greeting to you, daughter of King Numitor." Maria invited the young man to sit down beside her, and he at once consented. So they sat together, youth and maiden, on the damp floor in the malignant hall of Nero's golden house. In the magnificent hall of Nero's golden house, buried underground, and they looked into each other's eyes and knew not at first what to talk about. Then Maria pointed out the bas-relief to the young man, and began to tell him all the legend of the unhappy Vestal. But the youth interrupted her story. "I know this, Rhea," said he, "but how strange. The face of the girl in the bas-relief is actually like yours." "It is I," answered Maria. Sorry, I'm going to just check the chat. Okay. So much conviction was in her words that the youth was perplexed and knew not what to think. But Maria gently placed her hand on his shoulder and began to speak ingratiatingly, almost timidly. "Do not deny it. You are the god Mars in the form of a mortal, but I recognize you. I have expected you for a long while. I knew that you would come. I am not afraid of death. Let them drown me in the Tiber." For a long while the young man listened to Maria's incoherent speech. All around was strange. This underground palace, known to no one, with its magnificent apartments where only lizards and bats were living, and the obscurity of its immense hall barely lighted by the faint light of the 2 torches, and this obscure maiden like the Rhea Silvia of the ancient bas-relief, with unintelligible speeches, who in some marvellous fashion had lighted upon the buried golden house of Nero. The young man felt that the rude actuality of the life he had lived just before his entrance into the underground dwelling had vanished into thin air as a dream disappears in the morning. In another moment he might have believed that he himself was the god Mars, and that he had met here his beloved, Ilia the Vestal, the daughter of Numitor. Putting the greatest restraint upon himself, he broke in upon Maria's speech. "Dear maiden," said he, "listen to me. You are mistaken about me. I am not he for whom you take me. I will tell you the whole truth. Agapit is not my real name. I am a Goth, and my name is really Theodat. But I am obliged to conceal my origin, for I should be put to death if it were known. Haven't you heard by my pronunciation that I am not a Roman? When my fellow countrymen left the city, I did not follow them. I love Rome. I love its history and its tradition. I want to live and die in the eternal city, which once belonged to us. So now, under the name of Agapit, I am in the service of an armourer. I work by day, and in the evenings I wander about the city and admire its memorials, which have escaped destruction. As I knew that Nero's golden house had been built on this spot, I got into this underground palace so that I could admire the remains of its former beauty. That is all. I have told you the whole truth, and I do not think you will betray me, for one word from you would be enough to have me put to death." Maria listened to the words of Theodat with incredulity and dissatisfaction. After a little thought she said, "Why are you deceiving me? Why do you wish to take the form of a Goth? Can I not see the nimbus around your head? Mars gradivus, for others thou art a god, for me thou art my beloved. Do not mock thy poor bride, the Rhea Silvia." Theodat looked again for a long while at the young girl who spoke such foolish words, and he began to guess that Maria was not in her right mind. And when this thought came into his head, he said to himself, "Poor girl, I will never take advantage of your unprotected state. This would be unworthy of a Goth." Then he gently put his arms around Maria and began to talk to her as to a little child. not contradicting her strange fancies, but acknowledging himself to be the god Mars. And for a long while they sat side by side in the semi-darkness, not exchanging one kiss, talking and dreaming together of the future of Rome, which would be founded by their twin sons Romulus and Remus. At last the torches began to burn low, and Theodat said to Maria, "Dear Rhea Silvia, it is already late. We must go away from here." "But you will come again tomorrow?" asked Maria. Theodat looked at the young girl. She seemed to him strangely attractive, with her thin, half-childish figure, the hectic flush on her cheeks, and her deep black eyes. There was an incomprehensible attractiveness in the meeting of theirs in the dim hall of the buried palace before the marvellous bas-relief of an unknown artist. Theodat desired to repeat these minutes of strange intercourse with the poor crazy girl, and he answered, "Yes, maiden, tomorrow at this hour, after my day's work, I will come again to you here." Hand in hand they went in the direction of the way out. Theodat had a rope ladder with him. He helped Maria to climb up the hole, which served as an entrance to the palace. Evening had already fallen when they reached the streets. Before they separated, Theodat said once more, looking into Maria's eyes, "Remember, maiden, you must not tell anyone that you have met me. It might cost me my life. Goodbye until tomorrow." He got first into the open air and was soon out of sight round a bend of the road. Maria went slowly home. If it happened that evening that she had a talk with her father, she would not tell him that at last Mars Gradivus had come to her. Theodat did not deceive Maria. Next day, towards evening, he really came again to the Golden House, and to the bas-relief representing Mars and Rhea Silvia, where Maria was already awaiting him. The young man had brought with him some bread and cheese and some wine, and they had their supper together in the magnificent hall of Nero's palace. Maria mused aloud again about the beauty of life in the past, about gods, heroes, and emperors, mixing up stories of her own experience with the wanderings of her fancy. But Theodat, with his arm around the girl, gently stroked her hand or her shoulder and admired the black depth of her eyes. Then they walked together through the empty underground rooms, shedding the light of their torches on the great creations of Greek and Roman genius. When they parted, they again exchanged a promise to meet on the following day. From that time, every day, when Theodat had finished his dull labour at the armourer's workshop, where they made and repaired helmets, pikes, and armour for the company of Byzantines who were garrisoning Rome, he went to meet the strange young girl, who thought herself to be the Vestal Virgin Ilia, alive once more. There was an unconquerable attraction for the young man in the lissom body of the girl, and in her half-foolish words, to which he was ready to listen for whole hours together. They explored together all the halls, corridors, and rooms of the palace, as far as they could get. They rejoiced together over each newly found statue, each newly noticed bas-relief, and there was never a day but some unexpected discovery filled their souls with a new rapture. Day after day they lived in an unchanging happiness, enjoying the creations of art, and in moments of emotion before a new-found marble sculpture, the work perhaps of Praxiteles, young man and maiden would lean towards one another and embrace in a pure and blessed kiss. Imperceptibly, Theodat began to consider the golden house of Nero as his own home, and Maria became to him nearest and dearest in the world. How this happened, Theodat himself did not know, but all the rest of the time which he spent on the earth seemed to him a burdensome and distasteful obligation, and only the time that he spent with Rhea Silvia underground in the palace of the ancient emperor seemed to him to be real life. The whole day the young man awaited in a torture of impatience the moment when he could at last leave the brass helmets and hammers and pincers, and with the rope ladder hidden under his garments run off to the slope of the Esquiline for his secret meeting. Only by these meetings did Theodat reckon his days. If he had been asked what attracted him in Maria, he would have found it difficult to answer. But without her simple talk, without her strange eyes, all his life would have seemed empty and void. on the earth in the armourer's workshop, or in his own pitiful little room which he rented from a priest, Teodat could reason sanely. He would say to himself that this Rhea Silvia was a poor crazy girl, and that he himself perhaps was doing wrong in corroborating her pernicious fancies. But when he went down into the cool, damp obscurity of the golden house, Teodat, as it were, changed everything, his thoughts and his soul. He became something different, not what he was in the sultry heat of the Roman day or in the stifling atmosphere of the forge. He felt himself in another world there, where in reality could be met both the Vestal Virgin Ilia, daughter of King Numitor, and the god Mars, who had taken upon himself the form of a young Goth. In this world everything was possible, and all miracles were natural. In this world the past was still living, and the fables of the poets were clearly realized at every step. Not that Teodat fully believed in Maria's delusions, but when, before some statue of an ancient emperor, she would begin to speak of meeting him on the forum and talking with him, it seemed to Teodat that something of the sort had actually taken place. When Maria told him about the riches of her father, King Numitor, Teodat was ready to think that she was speaking the truth. And when she had visions of the glories of future Rome, which would be founded by the new Romulus and Remus, Teodat himself was led to develop these visions and to speak about the new victories of the Eternal City, its new conquest of territory, its new worldwide fame. And together they would imagine the names of the coming emperors who would rule in their children's city. Maria always spoke of herself as Rhea Silvia and Teodat as Mars, and he became so accustomed to these names that there were times when he deliberately called himself by the name of the ancient Roman god of war, and when both of them, young man and maiden, were intoxicated by the darkness and by the marvelous creations of art, by their nearness to one another, and by their strange half-crazy dreams, Teodat almost began to feel in his veins the divine ichor of the Olympian god. And again the days went by. At the very beginning of his acquaintance with Maria, Teodat had promised himself to spare the crazy girl, and not to take advantage of her weak intellect and her unprotected state. But with each new meeting it became in every way more and more difficult for him to keep his word. Meeting every day the girl he already loved with all the passion of youthful love, spending long hours with her, alone in this isolated place, in the half-darkness, touching her hands and shoulders, feeling her breathing close beside him, and exchanging kisses with her. Teodat was obliged to use great and greater effort not to press the girl to himself in a strong embrace, not to draw her to him with those caresses with which the god Mars had once drawn to himself the first Vestal. And Maria not only did not avoid such caresses, but she even, as it were, sought them, leaning towards him, attracting him to her with all her being. She lingered in Teodat's arms when he kissed her. She herself pressed him to her bosom when they were admiring the statues and pictures, and seemed every moment to be questioning the youth with her large blue eyes, as if she was asking him, "When? Will it be soon? I am tired of waiting." Teodat would ask himself, "And can it be true that she is crazy? Then I must be crazy too. And is not our craziness better than the reasonable life of other people? Why would we deny ourselves the full joy of love?" And so that which was inevitable came to its fulfillment. The marriage chamber of Maria and Teodat was one of the magnificent halls of the golden house of Nero. The resin twists, lighted and placed in ancient bronze candlesticks in the form of cupids, were their bridal torches. The union of the young couple was blessed by the marble gods, sculptured by Praxiteles, who looked down with unearthly smiles from their niches of porphyry. The great silence of the buried palace hid in itself the first passionate sighs of the newly wedded pair, and their pale faces were overshadowed by the mysterious obscurity of the underground palace. There was no solemn banquet, no marriage songs, but long ages of glory and power overshadowed the bridal couch, and its earth and ashes seemed to be lovers softer and more desirable than the down of Pontine swans in the sleeping apartments of Byzantium. From that evening Maria and Teodat began to meet as lovers. Their long talks were mingled with long caresses. They exchanged passionate confessions and passionate vows. in almost senseless speeches. They wandered again through the empty rooms of the Golden House, not so much attracted now by the pictures and statues, the marble walls and the mosaics, as by the possibility in the new room to fall again and again into each other's embraces. They still dreamed of the future Rome which would be founded by their children, but this happy vision was already eclipsed by the happiness of their unrestrained kisses, in whose burning atmosphere vanished not only actuality but also dreams. They still called themselves Rhea Silvia and the god Mars, but they had already become poor earthly lovers, a happy couple like thousands and thousands of others living on the earth after thousands and thousands of centuries. Never outside the hall of the subterranean palace did Teodat try to meet Maria, nor she him. They only existed for one another in the golden house of Nero. Perhaps they might not even have recognized one another on the earth. Teodat might have ceased to be for Maria the god Mars, and Maria would not have seemed to Teodat beautiful and wonderful. Truly, after their union, the honourable young Goth had said to himself that he ought to find out the real relatives of the young girl, to marry her and openly acknowledge her as his wife before all people. But day after day he put off the fulfilment of the resolve. It would have been terrible for him to destroy the fairy-like enchantment in which he was living, terrible to exchange the unheard-of ways of the underground hall for the ordinary realities. Perhaps Teodat did not thus explain his delay to himself, but all the same he did not hasten to bring to an end the burning happiness of these secret meetings, and every time he parted with Maria he renewed his vow to her that on the morrow he would come again. And she expected him and asked for nothing more. For her this visionary blessedness was sufficient to be beloved of a god. "Thou wilt always love me?" Teodat would ask, pressing the lissome body of Maria in his strong arms. But she would shake her head and say, I love thee until death. But thou art an immortal, and soon I must die. They will drown me in the waters of the Tiber. No, Teodat would say, that will not happen. We shall live together and die together. Without thee I do not wish to be immortal. And after death we shall love each other just the same here. And after death we shall love each other just the same there in our Olympus. But Maria would look at him distrustfully. She expected death and was prepared for it. She only wished one thing, to prolong her happiness as long as it was possible. The young man told himself that he ought secretly to follow Maria and find out where she lived, go to her real home, to her true father, and tell him that he, Agapit, loved his daughter and wanted to make her his wife. But when the hour of parting drew near, when Maria, having heard Teodat vow that he would come again tomorrow to the Golden House, glided away like a thin shadow into the evening distance, the youth would once more postpone his action. Let this be put off another day. Let us meet once more as Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. Let this fairy tale still continue. And he would go home to the little room he rented from the priest, to dream all night of his beloved and solace himself with new happiness of remembrance. And Teodat never asked anyone about the strange black-eyed girl, though almost everyone in Rome knew Maria. But in reality he did not wish to know anything about her except this, that she was the Vestal Ilia, and that every evening she lovingly awaited him in the subterranean hall of Nero's underground palace. But one day Maria, having waited till the evening, awaited Teodat in vain. The youth did not come. Grieved and disturbed, Maria went home again. Her mind had, in a way, become somewhat clearer since she had given herself to Teodat, and she was able to console herself with the thought that something must have prevented him from coming. But the youth did not come the next day, nor the next. He suddenly disappeared completely, and in vain that Maria waited for him at the appointed place hour after hour, day after day, waiting in anguish and despair, sobbing, praying to the ancient gods, and using the words which her mother had once taught her. There came no answer to her tears and prayers. As before, an unearthly smile played upon the faces of the gods in their niches in the walls. As before, the superb rooms of the ancient palace gleamed with paintings and mosaics, but the golden house suddenly became empty and terrible for Maria. From a blessed paradise, from the land of the Elysian fields, it had suddenly been changed into a hole of cruel torture, into a black Tartarus, where was only horror and solitude, unendurable grief and unbearable pain, With an insane hope, Maria went every day as before to the underground dwelling, but now she went there as to a place of torture. There awaited her the hours of disappointed expectation, the terrible reminders of her late happiness, and her long-renewed, inconsolable tears. It must it was most terrible of all, most distressing of all, near the bas-relief which represented the Rhea Silvia sleeping in the sacred cave, with the god Mars coming towards her. All her remembrances drew Maria to this bas-relief, yet near it the most unconquerable grief would overwhelm her soul. She would fall on the ground and beat her head against the stone mosaic pavement, closing her eyes that she might not behold the radiant face of the god. Come back, she would repeat in her frenzy. Come just once again. Divine Immortal, have pity on my sufferings. Let me see thee once again. I have not yet told thee all, have not given thee all my kisses. I must see thee once again in life. And after that, let me die. Let them cast me into the waters of the Tiber, and I will not resist. Have pity on me, divine one. And Maria would open her eyes again, and by the faint light of the torch she would see the unmoved face of the sculptured god, and then once more the remembrance of the blessedness which had suddenly been taken away from her would overwhelm her, and she would burst into new tears and sobs and wails. And she herself would hardly know if the god Mars had come to her, if in her life there had been those days of perfect happiness, or if she had dreamed them amongst thousands of other dreams. With every day her expectations grew more hopeless. Every day she would return to her home more anguished and more shaken. In those hours when there were glimmerings of consciousness in her soul, she remembered dimly all that Teldut had once told her about himself. Then she would wander through the streets of Rome, and under various pretexts she would look into all the armourers' workshops, but nowhere did she meet with him she sought. To speak of anyone of her grief and of her vanished happiness was impossible for her, and no one would have believed the stories of the poor crazy girl. Everyone would have considered them to be new wanderings of her disordered imagination. So Maria lived alone with her grief and her despair, and her mother only shook her head dejectedly as she saw her becoming thinner and more wasted, her cheeks more sunken and her eyes burning more feverishly and with more strange and fiery reflections. But the days passed by inconsolably, for the poor crazy girl, for the despoiled eternal city, and for the whole world in which a new life was slowly coming to birth. The days went by. Justinian celebrated his final victories over the remaining Goths. The Lombards fought out their Italian campaign. The Pope secretly forged the links of the chain, which in the future would connect Rome with all the world. The Romans continued to live their poor and oppressed lives, and one day Maria understood at last that she would become a mother. The Vestal Rhea Silvia, to whom the god Mars had condescended from his Olympus, began to feel within herself the pulsations of a new life. Were they not the twins, the new Romulus and Remus who must found the new Rome? To no one, neither to father nor mother, did Maria speak of what she felt. It was her secret, but she was strangely quieted by her discovery. Her dreams were being completely fulfilled. She must give birth to the founders of Rome, and afterwards await death in the muddy waters of the Tiber. Sometimes guests would gather together in the house of old Rufus, a neighbouring merchant who sold cheap women's finery in the Forum, the coppersmith's son, who at one time had wished to court Maria, an infirm orator who could no longer find a use for his learning, and a few other poverty-stricken people who were dejectedly living out their days, only meeting another to complain of their unhappy lot. They would drink poor wine and eat a little garlic, and among their customary complaints they would cautiously interpolate bitter words about the Byzantine rule and the inhuman demands of the new general who lived on the Palatine in place of the departed eunuch Narses. Florentia would serve the guests and poured out wine for them, and at the speeches of the old orator she would quietly cross herself at the mention of the accursed gods. At one of these gatherings, Maria was sitting in a corner of the room, having come home that day earlier than usual from her wanderings. Nobody paid any attention to her. They were all accustomed to see among them the silent girl, whom they had long ago considered to be insane. She never joined the conversation, and no one ever addressed a remark to her. She sat with her head bent in a melancholy fashion and never moved, apparently hearing nothing of the speeches made by the drinking party. On this day they were talking especially about the severity of the new general, but the coppersmith's son took upon himself to defend him. We must take into account, said he, that at the present time it is necessary to act rigorously. There are many spies going about the city. The barbarians may fall on us again. Then we should have to endure another siege. These accursed Goths, when they took themselves out of town for good, had hidden their treasures in various places, and now first one and then another of them had come back to Rome secretly and in disguise, digs up the hidden treasure and carries it away. Such people must be caught, and it would never do to be easy with them. The Romans will have all their riches stolen. The words of the coppersmith's son aroused curiosity. They began to ask him questions. He readily told all that he knew about the treasures hidden by the Goths in various parts of Rome, and how those of them who had escaped destruction strove to seek out these stores and carry them off. Then he added, "And it's only lately they caught one of them. He was clambering up the Esquiline, where there is an opening in the ground. He had a rope ladder. They caught him and took him to the general. The general promised to spare him if the accursed one would show him exactly where the treasure was hidden, but he was obstinate and he would say nothing. They tortured him, but got nothing out of him. So they tortured him to death." "And is he dead?" asked someone. "Of course he's dead," said the coppersmith's son. Suddenly an unexpected illumination lit up the confused mind of Maria. She stood up to her full height. Her large eyes grew still larger. Pressing both hands to her bosom, she asked in a breaking voice, "And what was his name? What was the name of this Goth?" The coppersmith's son knew all about it, so he answered at once. He called himself Agapit. He was working quite near in an armourer's workshop, and with a shriek Maria fell downwards on the floor. Maria was ill a long while, for many weeks. On the first day of her illness a child was born prematurely, a pitiful lump of flesh, which it was impossible to call either a boy or a girl. Florencia, with all her harshness, loved her daughter. While Maria lay unconscious for many days, her mother tended her and never left her side. She called in a midwife and a priest. When at length Maria came to her senses, Florencia had no reproachful tears for her. She only wept inconsolably and pressed her daughter to her bosom. Her mother's soul had divided everything. Later on, when Maria was a little better, her mother told her all that had happened and did not reproach her. But Maria listened to her mother with a strange distrust. How could Rhea Silvia believe it, when she was destined by the will of the gods to bring forth the twins Romulus and Remus? Either the girl's mind was entirely overclouded, or she believed her former dreams more than actuality. At the words of her mother she merely shook her head in weakness. She thought her mother was deceiving her, that during her illness she had borne twins, which had been taken from her, put into a wicker basket and thrown into the Tiber. But Maria knew that a wolf would find and nourish them, for they must be the founders of the new Rome. As long as Maria was so weak that she could not raise her head, no one wondered that she would not answer no questions and would be silent whole days, neither asking for food nor drink, nor wishing to pronounce a monosyllable. But when she recovered a little and found strength to go about the house, Maria continued to be silent, hiding in her soul some treasured thought. She did not even want to talk to her father any more, and she was not pleased when he began to declaim verses upon the ancient poets. At length one morning, when her father had gone out on business, and her mother was at market, Maria unexpectedly disappeared from home. No one noticed her departure. No one saw her again alive. But after some days the muddy waters of the Tiber cast her lifeless body on the shore. Poor girl, poor vestal of the broken vows, one would like to believe that throwing thy body into the cold embrace of the water, thou wert convinced that thy children, the twins Romulus and Remus, were at that moment drinking the warm milk of the she-wolf, and that in time to come they would raise up the first rampart of the future eternal city. If in the moment of thy death thou hadst no doubt of this, thou wert perhaps the happiest of all people in that pitiful half-destroyed Rome, towards which they already were moving from the Alps, the hordes of the wild Lombards. And that was that then. I'm just going to drink a little. Now, I have at least one more story from this collection, and it's shorter. And I wanted to start with it, but I remembered this one and decided to go for it. So this one is called Eluli, Son of Eluli, a story of the ancient Phoenicians. I'm just going to do this because doing so will later help me identify the moment when I started doing this bit. So Eluli, son of Eluli, the young scholar Dutrael, whose work on the head ornaments of the Carthaginians had already attracted attention, and Bouverie, his former tutor, now his friend, a corresponding member of the Academy of Inscriptions, were working at some excavations on the western coast of Africa, in the French Congo south of Miamba. It was a small expedition fitted out by private means, and originally consisting of 8 members. Most of them, however, had been unable to endure the deadly climate, and on one pretext or another had gone away. There remained only Dutrail, whose youthful enthusiasm conquered all difficulties, and old Bouverie, who, having all his life dreamed of taking part in an important excavation where his special knowledge was concerned, had in his old age, thanks to the patronage of his young friend, obtained his desire. The excavations were extremely interesting. No one had supposed the Phoenician colony to have spread itself so far south on the west coast of Africa, extending even beyond the equator. Every day's work enriched science and opened up a new perspective as to the positions of Phoenicia and her commercial relations in the 9th century BC. The work, however, was extremely arduous. No European had remained with Dutrail and Bouverie except their servant Victor. All the workmen were locals of the place. True it had been decided that in place of those who had left, other archaeologists should come and bring with them not only some French workmen and a new store of necessary instruments, guns, and food supplies, but also the letters, books, and newspapers of which Dutrail and Bouverie had long been deprived. But day followed day, and the wished-for steamer did not appear. Their stores were decreasing. They were obliged to hunt for their food, and Dutrail was especially anxious about the exhaustion of their supply of cartridges. The natives were already sullen and insubordinate, and in the event of a riot among them, their lack of arms might be dangerous. Beside this, the Frenchmen suffered greatly from the climate and from the intolerable heat, which was so great that in the daytime it was impossible to touch a stone without burning the hand. And now at last the bold archaeologists seemed likely to be overcome by the malevolent local fever which had attacked several of the company before their departure. Dutrail triumphed over everything. Day after day he subsided on the flesh of seabirds, tasting strongly of fish, and drank the warmish water from a neighbouring spring. He kept the mutinous crew of workmen in check, and himself worked with them, and yet still found time at night to write his diary and to keep a detailed account of all the archaeological treasures they had obtained. In the tiny hut which they had built under the shelter of a cliff, he had already put in order a whole museum of wonderful things which had lain almost 3 centuries in the earth, and now being restored to the world would soon bring about revolution in Phoenician law. Bouverie, on the contrary, though desiring with all his soul to remain with his young friend, was manifestly becoming weaker. It was more difficult for an old man to struggle against misfortunes and deprivation. Often, as he worked, his spade or his gun would simply drop from his hands, and he himself would fall unconscious to the ground. Added to this, he had begun to have attacks of the local fever. Dutrail tried to cure him with quinine and other medicines which were in their travelling chest, but the old man's strength was utterly given away. His cheeks had fallen in, his eyes burned with an unearthly glitter, and at night time he was tortured by paroxysms of dry coughing, shivering fits, fever, and delirium. Dutrail had long ago made up his mind to compel his friend to return to Europe as soon as the steamer should come, but for a long while he had been afraid to speak about the matter. He had felt that the old man would certainly refuse, would prefer as a scholar to die at his post, the more so as lately he had often spoken of death. To Dutrail's astonishment, however, Bouverie himself began to speak of leaving, saying it was evident that they must part, and although it was bitter for him to abandon the work he had begun, his illness compelled him to go, so that he might die in his native land. In the depths of his soul, Dutrail was almost offended by these last remarks of the old man, who could prefer his superstitious desire to be in his native land at the moment of his death, before the high interest of scientific research, but explaining this by Bouverie's illness, he at length applauded his friend's resolution, and said all that might be expected from him under the circumstances. That the fever was not so dangerous, that it would pass with the change of climate, that they would still do much work together, and so forth. 2 days later, Bouverie astonished his friend still further. On that day, the excavators had come upon a new and rich tomb. Dutrail was in ecstasy over such a discovery, and he could neither speak nor think of anything else. But in the evening, Bouverie called him, his former pupil, to his side in his half of the little hut, and begged him to witness his will. I'm much to blame, said Bouverie, not to have made my will before, but I've never had the time. All my life I've been entirely taken up with science, and I have never had time to think about my own affairs. But my health is getting so much worse that perhaps I shall never get away from here, so I must formulate my last desires. We are only 3 Europeans here, but you and Victor are enough to witness my will. So as not to agitate the old man, Dutrail agreed. The will was quite an ordinary one. Bouverie left the little money he had to dispose of to a niece, for he was unmarried and had no other relatives. He left small sums to his old servant, to the owner of the house in which he had lived for 40 years, and to various other people. His collection, the Phoenician and Carthaginian antiquities, gathered together during his long life, the old man bequeathed to the Louvre, and some separate small things to his friend Dutrail among the number. Coming at length to the last clause, Bouverie said in an agitated manner, This, strictly speaking, ought not to be included in the will. It is simply my request to you personally, Dutrail, but listen to it all the same. The request was that, after his death, Bouverie wanted his body to be sent to France and buried in his native town by the side of his mother. As he read this last clause of the will, the old man could not restrain his tears. In a breaking voice, he began to implore that whatever might happen, his request should be fulfilled. By a great effort, Dutrail controlled his anger and answered as gently and tenderly as he could. Devil take it, dear friend. You see, I'm quite sure you're not so ill as you think. If I agreed to witness your will, I did so for one reason, to please you, and for another, because it is never superfluous to put one's affairs in order. But as I am strongly convinced that you will get better and will laugh at your present anxiety about yourself, I will permit myself to make some objections. With the greatest caution, Dutrail pointed out to Bouverie that his request could hardly be fulfilled. There were no means at hand for embalming the body, and no coffin which could be hermetically sealed, and he asked whether it were worse to lie after death under African palms side by side with the dead of the great past than in some small provincial French cemetery. The only thing it was possible to promise in any case under such circumstances was that his body should be buried here in Africa at first and afterwards taken to France, though this would be difficult, troublesome, and above all useless. That's what I was afraid of, cried the old man despairingly. I was afraid that you would say just that. But I beg of you, I conjure you to fulfill my request, whatever it may cost you, even though you may have to give up the excavations for a time. Bouverie entreated, begged, wept, and at last, in order to pacify the old man, Dutrail was obliged to consent, to give his word of honour and even his oath. the will was signed. Next day, even before the sun had risen, their labours were resumed. They began to excavate the magnificent tomb they had come across the evening before. It was evident that the Phoenician settlement would show itself much more significant than they had at first supposed. At last, the tomb they had discovered had clearly belonged to a rich and powerful family, several generations of which had not only spent their whole lives under the inhospitable skies of equatorial Africa, but had also prepared here for themselves an eternal resting place. The sepulchre was built of massive blocks of stone and ornamented with bas-reliefs. Dutrail untiringly directed the workmen, and often took a pick or a spade himself. After great difficulty, they succeeded in discovering the entrance of the tomb, an enormous iron door that, in spite of the 28 centuries which had elapsed since it was closed, had to be carefully broken to pieces. Having succeeded at last in forcing an entrance and letting fresh air flow into the recesses of the tomb, Dutrail and Bouverie went in themselves, carrying torches in their hands. The pictures which presented themselves. Sorry. I need to drink. So I'm going to hold on a second. Okay, now I just need to find a straw. Okay. Ow. Ow. Okay. Let me check the chat. Okay. I'll just sip a bit of this and continue. So, the picture which presented itself to their gaze was enough to send an archaeologist out of his mind with delight. The tomb was apparently absolutely untouched. In the midst of it, a stone coffin was raised upon a stone platform in the shape of a fantastic monster, and grouped around this were many articles for household use, some fine specimens of crescent-shaped lamps, implements of war, images of gods, and other articles whose significance it would have been difficult to define at once. But the most striking fact was that the inner walls of the tomb were almost entirely covered with paintings and inscriptions. With the inrush of fresh air, the colours of the paintings, as is always the case, swiftly began to fade, but the inscriptions, which were written in some sort of black composition and even cut out to some depth in the stone, seemed as if wrought but yesterday. This especially enraptured Dutrail, for until then he had come across very few Phoenician inscriptions. He already had visions of unearthing here entirely new historical information, for example, about the connection of the Phoenicians with Atlantis, of which Schliemann's nephew had read in a Phoenician inscription on a vase found in Syria. In spite of the scorching heat, Dutrail busied himself in transferring all the things they had found to the museum, and he did not stop until the last crescent-shaped lamp had been placed in the washer in the wished-for spot. Then, carefully closing up the entrance of the tomb, the young scholar lay down to rest. But no sooner had the heat abated a little that he was again at work. He occupied himself in copying and deciphering the inscriptions, a work which, with all his splendid knowledge of the language was extremely complicated. When evening came, he had succeeded in copying only an insignificant number of the inscriptions, and in approximatingly deciphering still fewer. That night, sitting in their little hut by the dim light of a lamp, Dutrail shared his discoveries with Bouverie and begged his help in the interpretation of various difficult expressions. One series of inscriptions was clearly a simple genealogy leading up through 10 or 12 generations, but one consisted in an adjuration against violators of the peace of the tomb. Dutrail interpreted it approximately thus: "In the name of Astarte, who has been down into hell, may there be no peace for me, Eluli, son of Eluli, buried here. May there be peace for me, Eluli, son of Eluli, buried here. May I lie here for 1,000 years and for eternity. Nearest and dearest fellow countrymen and strangers, friends and foes, I adjure, touch not my ashes, nor my gold, nor the things belonging to me. If people persuade thee, give no ear to them. And thou, bold man, reading these words, which no human eye should ever see, cursed be thou upon the earth, and under the earth, where is neither eating nor drinking. Mayest thou never receive a place of rest with a Rephaim, never be buried in a tomb, never have a son or any issue. May the sun not warm thee, may wood never bear thee up upon water. May there not depart from thee for 1 hour the demon of torture, formless, pitiless, whose strength never becomes less." The inscription was continued further, but the end was unintelligible. Bouverie listened to the translation in profound silence, and did not wish to take any share in deciphering the rest. Pleading illness, he went off to his own half of the hut behind a wooden partition. But Dutrail sat on for a long while over his notes, consulting books they had brought with them, thinking over every expression and striving to understand every shade of meaning in the inscription. Late that night, when Dutrail was already sleeping the sound sleep of a wearied man, he was suddenly wakened by Bouverie. The old man had lighted a candle, and by its light he seemed still paler than usual. His hair was in disorder, his whole appearance indicated an extreme degree of terror. "What is the matter, Bouverie?" asked Dutrail. "You're ill?" Though it was difficult to struggle against his desire to sleep, Dutrail made an effort to awake, remembering the serious illness of his old friend. But Bouverie did not answer his question. He asked in a broken voice, "Did you see him too?" "Whom could I see?" objected Dutrail. "I'm so tired at the end of the day that I sleep without dreaming." "This was not a dream," said Bouverie sadly, "and I saw him go from me towards you." "Whom?" "The Phoenician, whose tomb we dug at." "Your mind's wandering, dear Bouverie," said Dutrail. "You have fever. I'll prepare a dose of quinine for you." "I'm not wandering," objected the old man obstinately. "I saw this man quite clearly. He was shaven and beardless, with a wrinkled face, and he was dressed as a soldier. He stood by my bed and looked threatening me and said—" "Wait a moment," interrupted Dutrail, trying to bring up the old man to reason. "In what language did he speak to you?" "In Phoenician. I don't know if perhaps at another time I should have understood the Phoenician language, but at that moment I understood every word." "What did the apparition say to you?" "He said to me, 'I am Eluli, son of Eluli, he whose peaceful repose you strangers have disturbed, not dreading my curse. Therefore I will have vengeance on thee, and what has befallen me shall come upon thee. Thy ashes shall not rest in thy native land, but shall be the prey of the hyena and the jackal. I will torment thee both, sleeping and waking, all thy life, and after thy life, and until the end of time.' When he had said this, he went towards you, and I thought you would see him too." Dutrail felt convinced that his friend's state was the result of illness, easily explained by the heat, by his continual thinking about death, and by the agitation consequent on their remarkable discovery. Wishing to bring the old man into a reasonable frame of mind, Dutrail did not remind him that the apparition were a delusion of sight, but he tried to make clear all the implausibility of the vision. "We did not excavate the tomb," said he, "to insult the ashes lying there, or to profit by the things collected there. We had a disinterested scientific object. Eluli, son of Eluli, has no reason for being angered with us. Science resurrects the past, and we, in raising up Phoenician antiquities, have also raised up this Eluli. The old Phoenician ought rather to be grateful for us calling him from oblivion. If it hadn't been for us, who in our day would have known that 1,000 years before Christ there once lived in Africa a certain Eluli, son of Eluli? Dutrail talked to the old man as to a sick child. At first Bouverie would not listen to any arguments, and he demanded that what was clearly impossible, that all the things should be taken back to the tomb at once, and the tomb itself buried anew. Little by little, however, he began to give way, and agreed to postpone the decision of the matter until the morning. Then Dutrail lifted the old man in his arms and laid him on his bed, covering him with quilts as he began to shiver, and sat down by his bedside until the sick man fell into a restless and disturbed sleep. What havoc illness plays with even the clearest mind, he thought sadly. On the morrow, logic and the obviousness of Dutrail's arguments gained the day. Bouverie agreed that his vision had been the result of a feverish delirium. He also agreed that it would be a crime against science and against humanity to fill up the excavations of the tomb. The work went on with the former enthusiasm, and in the tomb of Eluli and in others near it, they found even more precious historical things. The friends only awaited the arrival of the steamer with the necessary tools and some European workmen to begin excavating the town. But Bouverie's health did not improve. The fever did not leave him. He often cried aloud at night and leapt from his bed in unreasoning terror. Once the old man confessed that he had seen the Phoenician Eluli once again. Dutrail thought it good to laugh at him, and after this the old man spoke no more of his visions. But all the same he seemed to fade daily, and he even began to manifest signs of mental disturbance. He was afraid of the darkness and of the night, but he did not wish to go into the museum, and presently he absolutely abandoned the excavations. Dutrail shook his head and waited impatiently for the steamer, hoping that a sea voyage and his return to France might do the old man good. But in vain the two friends awaited the steamer. When at length it arrived, in the place where the members of the expedition had established their little settlement, nothing was found but a heap of ashes and charred wood. It was evident that the workmen had mutinied, killed the Europeans and stolen their property, and carried off all the things which had been arranged in the museum. The great discovery of Dutrail and Bouverie, which they had dreamed of would enrich Phoenician lore, was lost to mankind. That's the second one. And let me see, I was actually wanting to go to this next one. How long is it? And we have one more story from this collection, which is even shorter than that. I just needed to rehydrate a bit. And it's called In the Tower. And once again, I will do this so that I have an idea when later arranging the description to mark out the timestamps for the individual stories, where it actually was, and we can then continue. In the Tower, a recorded dream. There is no doubt that I dreamed all this, dreamed it last night. True, I never thought that a dream could be so circumstantial and so consecutive. But none of the events of this dream have any connection with what I am experiencing now, or with anything that I can remember. Yet how otherwise can a dream be differentiated from reality except in this way, that it is divorced from the continuous chain of events which occur in our waking hours? I dreamed of a knight's castle somewhere on the shore of the sea. Beyond it there was a field and a stunted yet ancient forest of pines. In front of it there stretched an expanse of grey northern billows. The castle had been roughly built with stone of a terrible thickness, and from the side it looked like a wild and fantastic cliff. Its deep, irregularly placed windows were like the nests of a monstrous bird. Within the castle were high, gloomy chambers with sounding passages between them. As I now call to mind the furniture of the room, the dress of the people about me, and other trifling details, I clearly understand to what period my dream had taken me back. It was the life of the Middle Ages, dreadful, austere, still half savage, and still full of impulses not yet under control. But in the dream I had not at first this understanding of the time, but only a dull feeling that I myself was foreign to that life into which I was plunged. I felt confusedly that I was some kind of newcomer into that world. At times this feeling was more intense. Something would suddenly begin to torture my memory, like a name which one wants to remember and cannot. When I was shooting birds with a crossbow, I would long for another and more effective weapon. The knights encased in their armour of iron, accustomed to murder, seeking only to plunder, appeared to me to be degenerate, and I foresaw the possibility of a different and more refined existence. As I argued with the monks on scholastic questions, I had a foretaste of some other kind of learning, deeper, fuller, freer. But when I made an effort to bring something into my memory, my consciousness was bedimmed anew. I lived in the castle as a prisoner, or more truly as a hostage. A special tower was allotted to me. I was treated with respect, but was kept under guard. I had no definite occupation of any kind, and the lack of employment was burdensome to me. But there was one thing which brought happiness and ecstasy into my life. I was in love. The governor of the castle was named Hugo von Riesen. He was a giant with a voice of thunder and strength of a bear. He was a widower, but he had one daughter, Matilda, tall, graceful, bright-eyed. She was like Saint Catherine, as the Italians paint her, and I loved her passionately and tenderly. As Matilda took charge of all the housekeeping in the castle, we used to meet several times a day, and every meeting would fill my soul with blessing. For a long while I could not make up my mind to tell Matilda of my love, though of course my eyes betrayed my secret. I uttered the fateful words quite unexpectedly, as it were, one morning at the close of winter. We met on the narrow staircase leading to the watchtower, and though it had often happened that we had been there alone together, in the snow-covered garden and in the dim hall under the marvellous light of the moon, for some reason or other, it was specially at this moment that I felt I could not be silent. I pressed myself close against the wall, stretched out my hands, and said, "Matilda, I love you." Matilda did not blench. She simply bent her head and answered softly, "I love you too. You are my chosen one." Then she ran away quickly up the stairs, and I stood there against the wall, still holding out my hands. In the most consecutive of dreams, there is always some break in the action. I can remember nothing of what happened in the days immediately following my confession of love. I remember only that I was walking with Matilda on the shore, though everything showed that some weeks must have elapsed. The air was already filled with the odours of spring, but the snow still lay on the ground. The waves with thunderous noise were rolling in with white crests onto the stony beach. It was evening, and the sun was sinking into the sea like a magic bird of fire, setting the edges of the clouds aflame. We walked along side by side. Matilda was wearing a coat lined with ermine, and the ends of her white scarf floated in the wind. We dreamed of the future, the happy future, forgetting that we were children of different races, and that between us lay an abyss of national enmity. It was difficult for us to talk, because I did not know Matilda's language very well, and she was quite ignorant of mine. But we understood much, even without words, and even now my heart trembles as I remember this walk along the shore within sight of the gloomy castle in the rays of the setting sun. I was experiencing and living through true happiness. Whether awake or in a dream, what difference does it make? It must have been on the following morning that I was told Hugo wished to speak to me. I was taken into his presence. He was seated on a high bench covered with elk furs. A monk was reading a letter to him. Hugo was glowering and angry. When he saw me, he said sternly, "Aha, do you know what your countrymen are doing? Was it such a little thing for us to defeat you at Izborsk? We set fire to Pskov, and you besought us to have mercy. Now you're asking help from Alexander, who glories in the appellations of Nevsky. But we are not like the Swedes. Sit down and write to your people of our might, so that they may be brought to reason. And if you refuse,
then you and all the other hostages will pay cruelly for your refusal. It is difficult to explain fully what feelings took possession of me then. Love for my native land was the first which spoke powerfully in my soul, an elemental, inexplicable love, like one's love toward one's mother. I felt that I was a Russian, that in front of me were enemies, that I stood for all Russia. At the same moment I perceived and acknowledged with bitterness that the happiness of which Matilda and I had dreamed of had for ever departed from me, that my love for a woman must be sacrificed to my love for my native land. But scarcely had these feelings filled my soul, when, in the very depths of my consciousness, there suddenly flamed an unexpected light. I understood that I was sleeping, that everything, the castle, Hugo, Matilda, and my love for her, everything was but a dream. And I suddenly wanted to laugh in the face of this stern knight and his monk assistant, for I knew that already that I should wake and there would be nothing, no danger, no grief. I felt an unconquerable courage in my soul, because I could get away from my enemies into that world whither they were unable to follow me. Holding my head high, I replied to Hugo, "You know yourself that that is not true. Who called you to these lands? This sea is Russian from time immemorial. It belonged to the Varyagi. You came here to convert the people, and instead of that you have built castles on the hills. You oppress the people, and you threaten our towns, even as far as to Ladoga itself. Alexander Nevsky undertook a holy work. I rejoice that the people of Pskov had no pity on their hostages. I will not write what you wish, but I will encourage them to fight against you. God will defend the right." I said this as if I were declaiming upon a stage, and I purposefully chose ancient expressions so that my language might fit the period, but my words threw Hugo into a frenzy. "Dog," cried he to me, "Tartar slave, I will order you to be broken on the wheel." Then there came swiftly to my remembrance, as if I had been revelation given to a seer from on high, the whole course of Russian history, and I spoke to the German triumphantly and sternly as a prophet. "Know this, that Alexander will overcome you on the ice of the Chutsky Lake. Knights without number will there be hewn down, and our descendants will take all this land under their dominion, and have your descendants in subjugation to them." "Take him away," cried Hugo, the veins on his neck swelling and purpling with anger. The servants led me away, not to my tower, but to a noisome underground place, a dungeon. The days dragged away in the damp and darkness. I lay on rotting straw, mouldy bread was thrown into me for food. For whole days I heard no sound of a human voice. My garments were soon in rags, my hair was matted, my body was covered with sores. Only in unattainable dreams did I picture to myself the sea and the sunlight, the spring, the fresh air and Matilda, and in the near future the wheel and whipping post awaited me. As the joy of my meetings with Matilda had been real to me, so were my suffering in her father's dungeon. But the consciousness in myself that I was sleeping and having a bad dream did not become dim. Knowing that the moment of awakening was at hand, and that the walls of my prison would disperse as a mist, I found in myself the strength to bear all my tortures unrepiningly. When the Germans proposed that I should buy my freedom with the price of treachery to my native land, I answered with a defiant refusal, and my enemies themselves esteemed my firmness, which cost me less than they fought. Here my dream breaks off. I may have perished by the hand of the executioner, or have been delivered from bondage by the victory of the Battle of Ice on April 5th, 1241, as were other hostages from Pskov, but I simply awakened, and here I am, sitting at my writing table, surrounded by familiar and beloved books, and I am recording this long dream, intending to begin the ordinary life of this day. Here in this world, among these people who are in the next room, I am home. I am actually... But a strange and dreadful thought quietly arises from the dark depths of my consciousness. What if now I am sleeping and dreaming, and I shall suddenly awake on the straw in the underground dungeon of the castle of Hugo von Riesen? So that'll be that one then. Just going to drink a little. Okay, now let me check the next one. We finished with that one, as I said. Now going through this, I'm seeing.
That one's a bit long. We can do Dinah's Mammoth. How much is the black? And we can do the Black Reaper. So let me just change the image. Now I'm actually reading from At a Winter's Fire, from I have to actually look up the publication page. I can't believe it. 1896, I think, because this is unreadable. Here we go. I'm actually from 1906, rather. Okay. Now then, I need to go to page 251, and that's still a bit further. Okay. Still in a moment. Okay. So almost there. So there we go. So this story is called, I'll just do that briefly so I know which one it is. It's called Dinah's Mammoth. I close that and that. Okay. One day, early in the summer of the present year, Miss Dinah Groom was found lying dead off a field path of the little obscure Wiltshire village which she had named her Rest and Be Thankful. At the date of her decease, she was not an old woman, though anyone marking her white hair and much furrowed features might have supposed her one. The hair, however, was ample in quantity, the wrinkles rather so many underscores of energy, than evidence of senility, and until the blinds were drawn over her soul, she looked into and across the world with a pair of eyes that seemed to reflect the very blue and white of a June sky. No doubt she had thought to breast the hills and sail the seas again in some renaissance of vigour. No doubt her retreat, like a Roman Catholic's, was designed to be merely temporary. She ate the hermit for the sake of a sojourn in the hermitage. She came to her island of Avalon to be restored of her weary limbs and her blistered feet, so to speak, and there her heart, too weak for her spirit, failed her, and she fell amongst the young budding poppies and died. I use the word heart literally and in no sentimental sense. The talk of associations of sentiment in connection with this lady would be misleading. She herself would not have repudiated any responsibility for the term as applied to her. She would have simply failed to understand the term itself. There was no least affectation in this. Throughout her life of 60 years, as I gather, she acted never once upon principle. Impulse and inclination dominated her, and she would indulge many primitive instincts without a thought of conventions. Yet she was not selfish, or at least not only in the self-contained and self-protective manner of the word. She was a perfect animal conscious of her supreme brute caste, shrewd, resourceful, and the plain embodiment of truth. Miss Groom had, I think, a boundless feeling of fellowship with beauty of whatever description, but no least touch of that sorrow of affection which, in its very humanity, is divine. Her unswerving creed was that woman was the inheritrix of the earth, the reversion of which she had wilfully mortgaged to an alien race, and that she had bartered her material immortality for a sensation. For man she had no vulgar and jealous contempt, but she feared and shrank from him as something moved by scruples with which she had no sympathy. She understood the world of nature and could respond to its bloodless caresses and passions. She could not understand the moodiness that dwells upon a grievance, or that would sell its birthright of joy for a pitiful memory. Yet, and here I must speak with direction, for I have no sufficient data to go upon, with discretion, for I have no sufficient data to go upon, there was that of contradictoriness in her character that I have reason to believe she had borne children, and had even been right in particular as to their temporal welfare until such a time as, in the nature of things, they would have been able to make shift for themselves. This virtually I know to be the case.
and that once quit of the primitive maternal responsibility, she gave no more thought to them than a thrush gives to its fledglings when she had educated them to their first flights, and to the useful knack of cracking a snail on a stone. My own feelings about Dinah Groom was that she had thrown back a long way over the heads of heredity, and that in her fearlessness, in her undegenerate physique, in the animal regularity of her face and form, she presented the modern day a startling aboriginal type. Beautiful save in the sense of symmetry, she can never have been to the ordinary man, inasmuch as she would subscribe to no arbitrary standard of his dictating. She had a high, rich colour, but her complexion must always have been rough, and a pronounced little moustache crossed her lip like an accent to the speech that was too distinct and uncompromising to be melodious. Her every limb and feature, however, was instinct with capability, and in her presence one must always be moved to marvel over that indescribable worship of disproportion that has grown to be the religion of a shapely person, of a shapely race. How I first became acquainted with Miss Groom it is unnecessary to explain. During the last 3 years of her life, I was fortunate to be her guest in the Wiltshire retreat for her. During the last 3 years of her life, I was fortunate to be her guest in the Wiltshire retreat for an aggregate of many months. She took a fancy to me, to my solitariness and moroseness, perhaps, and she not only liked to have me with her, but after a time she fell into something of a habit of recalling for my benefit certain passages and experiences of her past life. In doing this, there was no suggestion of confidence, and I am breaking no faith in alluding to them. She was a fine talker, rugged, unpicturesque, but with an instinctive capacity of selection in words. If I quote her as I wish to do, I cannot reproduce her style, and that no doubt would appear bold on paper, but at least the matter is all her own. Now I must premise that I arrogate myself no exhibitory rights in this lady. She was familiar with, and to many from the foremost ranks of those who follow knowledge like a sinking star, those great and restless spirits to whom inaction reads stagnation. To such, in all probability, I tell, in speaking of Dinah Groom, a twice-told tale, and therefore, inasmuch as I make it my business only to print what is hitherto unrecorded, to them I give the assurance that I do not claim to have discovered their friend. On a wall of the little embowered sitting-room hung a queer picture by Ernest Grissett of the overwhelming of the mammoths in the ice. From the first, this odd conception had engaged my curiosity, purely for its fanciful side, and one evening, in alluding to it, I made the not very profound remark that imagination had no anatomy. "They are true beasts," said Dinah. "They are the mastodons of Cuvier, no doubt, but then Cuvier never saw a mastodon, you know. But I have, and I tell you Grissett and Cuvier are very nearly right." I expressed no surprise. In what were they astray?" I asked. "The mammoth, as I saw it, had a huge hump, like a steam chest of enormous engine, over its shoulders. And where did you see it, and when?" "You are curious to know?" "Yes, I think I am. And that is a quiet of expectancy abroad. I heard the ghost of my dead brother walking in the corridor, Dinah, and we are all waiting for you to speak." She smiled and said, "Push me over the cigarettes." She struck a match, kindled the little crackling tube, and threw the light out into the shrubbery. It traced a tiny arc of flame and vanished. The sky was full of the mewing of lost kittens, it seemed. The sound came from innumerable peewits that fled and circled above the slopes of the darkening meadows below. "What an uncomfortable seer you are," she said, to people this dear human night with your fancies. "No doubt now you will read between the lines of that bird speech down there." She looked at me curiously, but with none of the mournful speculativeness of a soul struggling against the dimness of its own visions. "To me it is articulate happiness, nothing more abstruse. Yes, I have seen a mastodon, and I was glad to happen on the beast as a naturalist is glad to find a missing link in a chain of evidence. From the moment I knew myself quite clearly to be recovered. From the moment I knew myself quite clearly to be the recovered heir to this abused planet. She paused a moment and contracted her brows, as if regretfully and in anger. If I had only seen it sooner, she cried low, before I had, in my pride of strength, tasted the poison that has bewildered the brains of my sisters. Her general reserves was half self-armour against the bolts of the Philistines. What worldling would not have read mania in much that was spoken by this same woman? Yet indeed, if he were all to find the power to give expression to our inmost thoughts, madness and sanity would have to change places in the order of affairs. Once, said Dinah, and it was when I was a young woman, a man in whom I was interested shipped as a passenger on a whaling vessel. This friend was what is called a degenerate. Physically and morally, he had yielded his claim to any share in that province of the sun that his race had conquered and annexed, only to find it antipathetic to its needs. Combative effort was grown impossible to him, as in time will grow to you all. You drop from the world like dead flies from a wall. He could not physic his soul with words and groves and waters, with woods and groves and waters. To his perceptions, life was become an abnormality, a disease of which he sickened, as you all must when the last of the fever aggressions has been diluted out of your veins. You die of your triumph, as the bee dies of his own weapon of defense. As the bee dies of its own weapon of offense, and you can find no antidote to the poison in the nature you have inoculated with your own virus. This man contemplated self-destruction as the only escape. He had sought distraction of his moral torments and travel long and varied. Many of the most beautiful of the historically interesting places of the world he has visited and sojourned in without avail. His haunting feeling, he said, was that he did not belong to himself. Pursued by his nemesis, he came to end it all. He still proclaimed his spiritual independence, but it was enmeshed, and he must tear the strands. This was wonderfully perplexing to me, and out of my curiosity, I must persuade him to make one more attempt. His late efforts, I assured him, were nothing but an endeavour to cure nausea with sweet syrups. He would not get his change out of nature but by such pitiful wooing. Let him rather emulate, if he could not feel, the spirits of his remote forebears, and rally his nerves to an expedition into the harsh and awful places of the earth. I would accompany him, and watch with him, and for him, and supply that of the fibre he lacked. He consented, and after some difficulty, for there is an economy of room in whalers, we obtained passage in a vessel and sailed into the unknown. Our life and our food were simple and rugged, but the keen air, the relief from luxury, the novelty and the wonder wrought upon my companion and renewed him, so that presently I was amused to note in him signs of a moral preening, some smug resumption of that arrogant air of superiority that is a tradition with your race. Miss Groom here puckered her lips and breathed a little destructive laugh upon her cigarette ash. It did not last long, she said. We encountered very bad weather, and his nerves again went by the board. There was in the 60th longitude, I think, where whales were still to be found in those years, and 700 miles or so to the east of Spitzbergen. On the day, it was in August, that the storm first overtook. The boats were out in pursuit of a right whale, as I believe the men called it, a great bull creature and piebald like a horse, and I saw the spouting of his breath, as if a water main had burst in a London fog. The wind came in a sudden charge from the northwest, and the whale died with a harpoon in its back, and in the confusion a reel fouled, and one of the boats was whipped under in a moment, half a mile down, perhaps, and its crew drawn with it, and their lungs, full of air, burst like bubbles. We had no time to think of them. We got the other boatload on board, and then the gale sent us crashing the slopes of the sea. I have no knowledge of how long we were cursed out. We were cursed out the tempest and the sport of its raving. I only know that when it released us at last, we had been hurled 1,000 miles eastward. The long the long interval was all a hellish jangle in which time seemed obliterated.
Sorry, I'm going to check the chat again. And just checking my messages. Sorry. Okay. Okay, turning that off and okay.
The long interval was all a hellish jangle in which time seemed obliterated. Sometimes we saw the sun, a furious red globe, and we seemed to stand still while it raced down the sky and ricocheted over the furthersome waves like a red-hot cannonball. Sometimes, in pitch darkness, the wild sense of flight and expectation was an ecstasy. But through all my friend lay in a half-delirious stupor. At length the morning broke, full of icy scud, but the sea panting and exhausted of its rage, as a child catches its breath after a storm of tears, so it would heave up suddenly, and vibrate and sink, and we rocked upon it, a ruined hulk. We were off a flat vacant shore, if shore you could call it, whose margin for miles inland seemed undulated with the lifting of the swell. It was treeless desolation manifest, and on our seaside, so far as the eye could reach, the water bobbed and winked with countless spars of ice. I will tell you at once, my friend, we were brought to opposite in a human swamp on the coast of Siberia, 50 miles or more, in human swamp on the coast of Siberia, 50 miles or more to the west of the northeast Cape. And there what remained of the crew made shift to cast anchor, and for a day and night the ragged ship curtsied to the land like a blind beggar to an empty street, and we only dozed in our corners and wondered at the silence. By and by the men made a raft, and that took us all ashore. There was something like a definite coastline then, but for long before we touched it, the underside of the planks was scraping and hissing over vegetation. This was the winter fur of the land, thick coarse tundra moss, and on that we pitched a camp, and on that we remained for long weeks while the ship was mending. It was a weird, lonely time. Once or twice strange wandering creatures came our way, little belted men with hairless faces who rode up on strong horses and liked to exhibit their skilful management of them. They talked to us in that chirpy jargon, Tungus I think it was called, but jargon it must needs remain to us. Well, we made a patch of the hulk. We made a patch of the hulk, and we shipped in her again. We were fortunate to be able to do that, for with every stiflish wind blowing inshore, we had feared she would drag her moorings and ground immovably on the swamp. The land indeed was so flat and low that whenever the sea rose at all, it threshed the very plains and crackled in the moss. And we were glad, despite the risk, to leave so lifeless a place. Dinah paused to light another cigarette and to inhale the ecstasy of the first puff or so before she continued. Up through the still evening, from a curve of the main road that crooked an elbow to her front garden, came what sounded like the purring of a great cat, the wind in the telegraph wires. And I am now to you. Sorry, and Emma. Sorry, I need to drink something. And I am now to tell you, she said, about the mastodon. As you please, I answered. I do please, for why should I keep it to myself? It makes no difference, only I warn you, if you quote me, you will be writ down a fool or a maniac. This relation lacks witnesses, for the whaler that I subsequently quitted for another homing vessel was never heard of in a port any more. She looked at me with some serious scrutiny before she went on. For those regions, it had been an extraordinary hot summer, phenomenally hot, I understand, and to the melting and breaking away of the ice from hitherto century-locked fastness, the captain attributed the wonderful experience that befell us. The sea was strewn with blocks and bergs, all hurrying onwards in the strong currents, as if in haste to escape the pursuing demon of frost that should refetter them. And their multitude kept the steamer's arms spinning till the man would fall. The steersman's arms spinning till the man would fall half fainting over the spoke handles. Now, one morning early in September, a dense, bright fog dropped suddenly upon the waters. We were making what sail we could, with our crippled spears and stunted trees of masts, and this it were useless to shorten, and so invite a rearward bombardment from the chasing hummocks. So we kept our course by the compass, and trailed on through a blind mist, while fear drummed in our throats. The demoralization of my friend was by this time complete. For myself, I seldom had a thought but that nature would sheath her claws when she played with me. This cannot last long, said the captain. The words were on his lips when we struck with a noise like the splintering of glass. We were all thrown down, and my companion screamed like a mad thing. The captain rose and ran to the bows, and in a moment he came back, and his beard was shaking. God save us, he cried, and fetch off the rum. There you have man in his invincible moods. They drink till they were in a condition to face death, and then they found that our situation was rather improved than otherwise by the collision, for, so it appeared, we had run full tilt for a perpendicular fissure in a huge block, and into that our bows were firmly wedged, the nature of that impact distributing the shock, and the berg itself carrying us along with it and protecting us. Now the dipping motion of the vessel was exchanged for a heavy regular wash along its stern quarters, for the bows were so much raised as that I felt a light strain on my knees as I went forward to satisfy my curiosity with a view of the icy mass into which we were penetrated. I waited indeed until the crew were come aft again from looking, and my friend crept timidly at my shoulder. But when we reached the stem, there was one of the hands, a little sober than his fellows, sprawled over the bulwarks and staring with all his eyes into the green lift of the wall against him. Is it a mermaid you see, Killigrew? I asked. The man shifted his gaze to me slowly and solemnly. Now, said he, but a terrible monster, like a prawn stuck in jelly. I laughed and went to his side. The fog, as I had said, was dense and bright, and one could see into it a little way, as into a milky white agate. But now and again a film of it would pull thin, and then sunlight came through and made a dim radiance of the ice. I could make out nothing, I said. He cocked an eye and leered up at me. Look steady and sober, he said, and you will make 'em like as in glass dark. Sorry, I'm trying to get the accent as and I'll make him like as in glass darkly. I gave a little gasp, and my friend a cry before the words were issued from the man's mouth. Drawn by some current of air, the fog at that moment blew out of the cleft like a smoke from a chimney, and there before our gaze was a great curved tusk coming up through the ice and inside it. Now I clapped my hands in an agony, lest the fog should close in again, and the vision fade before my eyes. For following the sweep of the tusk, I was aware of the phantom presentment of some monster creature lying embedded within the ice, its mighty carcass prostrate as it had fallen, the confirmation of its enormous forehead presented directly to our gaze, its little toffee ball eyes, little proportionately, that is to say, squinted at us, it seemed, through half-closed lids, and a huge hairy trunk lay curled like the proboscis of a dead moth between its tree-like forelegs. Away beyond, the great red-brown drum of its hide bellied upward on ribs as thick as a Dutch galliots, and sprouting from its shoulders was the hump I have mentioned, but here from its position sprawled abroad and lying over in a shapeless mass. There was something else horribly nauseating but for its strangeness. The brute had been partly disembowelled, as there was ample evidence to show, for the ice had preserved all. Suddenly my companion gave a high, nervous shriek. "Look!" he cried. The hand sticking out of his side." I saw in a moment, turned and called excitedly to the captain. All the crew came tumbling toward us up the slippery deck. I seized him by the shoulder. "Do you see?" I screamed. "The human hand beckoning to us from that great body." He gazed stupidly, swaying where he stood. "One of them bloomin' pre-Hadamite cows," he muttered, "caught in a cold nip by thunder, and some unfortunate crept into her for warmth." I believe the creature's rude intuition had flown true. Cannot you get at it?" I gasped. He stared at me. All in an instant, a little paltry demon of avarice blinked out of his eye holes. "Why," he cried, "who knows but it mayn't be a gal a-jingling from top to toe with gold-curtained rings." He was a furious daredevil immediately, and quick and savage and peremptory. His spirits entered into his men. They went over the side with pikes and axes, and scrambling for any foothold, set to work on the ice like maniacs. In the lust of cupidity, they did not even think how they wrought against their own safety and that of the ship. The point of the uppermost tusk came to within a foot of the ice surface. This they soon reached, and prizing frantically with crowbars, flaked off and rolled away half-ton blocks of the super-encumbrant mass. I need not detail the fierce process. In half an hour they had laid bare a great segment of that part of the trunk whence the hand protruded, and then they paused, and at a word flung down their tools. I was leaning over the bulwarks, watching them. I could contain my excitement no longer. "Come," I said to my friend, "help me down, for I must go." He climbed over, trembling, and assisted me to a standing on the ice. We scrambled along the track of debris left by the crew. At the moment, half a dozen of the latter were rolling back a broad flap of the hill in which they had found a long L-shaped rent revealed. Then a coarse cry broke from them, and I stumbled and forward and looked down and saw. They lay beneath the mighty ribs as in a cage, of which the intercostal spaces were a foot in width, and the bars of a strength to maintain the enormous pressure of that which had surrounded and entombed them. They lay in one close group, their naked limbs smeared with the stains of their prison, a man, a woman, and a tiny child. From their faces and their unfallen flesh they might have been sleeping, but they were not. They were come down to us, a transfixture of death, prehistoric people in a prehistoric brute, and their eyes. Dinah's voice trailed off into silence. Some expression that I could not interpret was on her face. There was regret in it, but nothing of pathos or mysticism. Suddenly she braved out a great sigh and resumed her narrative. You will want to know how they looked. These lifeless survivors of a remote race from a remote time, I will try to tell you. The men hacked away the ribs with their axes, and they laid bare the group lying in their hollow scooped out of the fallen beast. They were little people, and the man, according to your modern canons of taste, was by far the most beautiful of the three. He sat erect with one uplifted arm projecting through the ribs, as if surprised by the sudden frost stroke. He had started to escape and had been petrified in the act. His face, wondering and delicate as a baby's, was hairless, and his head only a pretty infantile down covered, a curling floss as radiant as spun glass. His wide-open eyes glinted yet with a hyacinth blue, and it was difficult to realize that they were dead and vacant. The woman was of a coarser mould, ruddy, vigorous, brown-haired and eyed. She looked like the hamadryad of some blossoming tree, a sweet, capricious daughter of the blameless earth. Everything luxuriated in her, colour, hair, and lusty flesh, and the child she held to her bosom with a manner that indescribably commingled contempt and resentment and a passion of proprietorship. This baby, joining the prominent characteristics of the two, was the oddest little mortal I have ever seen. What did its expression convey to me? I am fairly caught and must brazen out the situation. There, that was what it was. I cannot put it more lucidly. Only the things we face was animal conscious for the first time of itself, and inclined to rejoice in that primitive energy of knowledge. Now, my friend, I must tell you the sight operated upon me and my companion. For myself, I can only say that looking down upon that fine, independent foremother of my race, I felt the sun in my veins and the viney fragrance of antique woods and pastures. I laughed. I clapped my hands. I danced on the ice rubbish so that they thought me mad. But for the other, the man, he was in a different plight. He was transfigured. His nervousness was gone in a flash. He cast himself down upon his knees and gazed, his hands clasped upon the sleek, mild progenitor of his, that pure image of gentle self-containment, whose very meekness suggested an indomitable will. Suddenly he, my friend, cried out, "This is one caught in the process of materialization. It is not flesh. My God, no." I seemed indeed as if it were as he said. I stopped my caperings and looked down. The Terry Hines, standing by, grinned and jeered. On the instant there came a splintering snap, and the floe rocked and curtsied. "Back!" yelled the captain. "She's breaking through by the head." He shrieked of the ship. She was clearing herself, had already shaken her prow free of the ice. There was a wild scamper for safety. I was carried with the throng. It was not until I was hauled on board once more that I thought of my friend. He still knelt where we had fled from him, a rapt, strange expression on his face. "Come back," I screamed. "You'll be lost." Now at that he turned his head and looked at me, but he never moved, and his voice came to me quiet and exultant. "Lost," he said. "Aye, for 43 years, and here I find myself." We dipped, and the wash of the water came about our bows. A block of ice swerved, made a sluggish half pirouette, and dropped astern. "Come!" I shrieked again faintly. With the echo of my cry, he was a phantom, a blot, had vanished in the rearward fog, and thereat a little joyous laugh came to me. And that was a queer goodbye forever, wasn't it? So that was Dinah's Mammoth. Like I said, we're just over the 2-hour mark, and I believe that, considering that I didn't really promote the stream very much, and so we don't really have much of an audience at the moment, I would probably leave this off for the present, and hopefully get a little more audience next time by planning things a little more appropriately and a little less spontaneously. So for those watching the board, I once again encourage you to potentially look into the description, find the link to our GoFundMe and our PayPal page, and if possible, potentially donate to us that we can solve this current issue with the whole apartment situation. We're still in the process of resolving it. Again, as I mentioned previously, I'm still going to call at the director, as it were, of the specific office that I had issues with, as I was directed to remonstrate them about their illegal ignoring of my official motion that they were bound legally to respond to within 3 months and did not. But again, this is an official complaint, and who knows how long that might take. And honestly, just makes me very irritated that I still have to do all this, and apparently they just don't care, and they have to be reminded of everything and fought every step of the way. Anyway, it is not required, but again, any little bit helps and any little bit is appreciated. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next stream, hopefully tomorrow. I'll see how it is, and I'll see how we are then. So later. And thank everyone for watching, and thanks to everyone watching the board at a later date.